Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Crusades, right? We left off in class discussing the rise of the Crusades, which are going to be a set of religious warfares that break out during the High Middle Ages and span all the way into the Late Middle Ages, due to the fact that literally there was like 9 of them, and the Christians didn't fare so well. But of course, as we already talked about a little bit as well, or loosely talked about, we discussed how the city of Jerusalem is going to fall into the control of the Muslim empires, and like probably at the time the Umayyad Caliphate. I'll have to go look that up and stuff like that. But at the time, it's going to fall into the hands of a different empire, right? And so the Christian kingdoms of Europe are going to decide to get together and try to go over there and take it back, right? Now, the interesting thing about these entire set of holy wars, though, is that a lot of people only learn a very, very small amount of it from the top. And a lot of people also don't realize that these things still reflect in modern day society, and that we still see constant themes of these wars popping up even to this day. And a big thing that I have to do as a teacher is make sure that you not only, okay, as Catholic school students, understand the point, the historical impact, and the reason why we study them, but I also need you to learn a little bit about the faith of Islam, right? And I need you to learn a little bit about that faith because it is one of the major Abrahamic faiths, right? The Abrahamic faiths being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Now, you need to learn about them because they share a lot of common traits, and they actually share way more similarities than they do differences. And in ignorance lives hate and stupidity, right? So we must actually learn about these people, give them their respect, and understand how they play a part in this story, right? Now, going into it, though, we left off in class talking about how people who practice Islam are referred to as Muslim, right? That is a person of that faith, right? Not two different things. That their prophet is a man by the name of Muhammad, who is going to be a Bedouin trader who shows up in a very important city known as Mecca in Saudi Arabia around 610 AD, right? And when he shows up in Mecca, he's going like, I have heard the message of the angel Gabriel, and he has told me that we need to stop being polytheistic and instead be monotheistic and worship the one true God that he referred to as Allah, right? And so the thing that you need to understand, though, is that the people of Saudi Arabia are not going to take very kindly to this at first, because when you show up and tell them that their faith is wrong, people really don't just go, oh, that's a great idea. So what ended up actually happening, though, is they ran him out of Mecca, right? And banished him and sent him out into the desert. And whilst he was out in the desert trying to spread his ideas and his faith, he wrote their holy book, right? Known as the Quran. And what's going to happen is some years later, he is going to return with an army of Bedouin traders to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and go to the same temple that he started discussing this faith at, right? He went to a very large temple in Mecca, and he was like, you need to stop worshiping the idols that are inside of this building and focus on Allah, because he is the one true God. And that is where they actually banished him from. And then what ends up happening, though, is he shows back up with an army, and this time he goes into that temple and smashes and destroys all the statues inside of it, right? Beginning the faith in that sacred place. Now, speaking of that sacred place, we'll come back to it here in a second, but then we started talking a little bit about the 5 pillars of Islam that are showing up in their faith as outlined in the Quran, right? Now, we talked about the number 1, which is the declaration of faith, which is much like a verbal baptism, where they accept the fact in their heart that there is one God, his name is Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? And then the other big one is alms for the poor, which is another similarity that they actually share with Christians, right? Giving or alms giving to the poor and the unfortunate is a major theme in Judaism, Christianity, and in the faith of Islam, right? Now, the thing about it, though, speaking of similarities as well, with Catholicism, there are 7 sacraments in Catholicism, there are 5 pillars of Islam, and these things are much like their version of sacraments, right? Because another one that they have to do daily is 5 times a day prayer, right? They must face eastward towards Mecca, or westward, depending on what hemisphere they're in, and face towards the city of Mecca, and they must pray 5 different times a day, right? Now, there's like different sects of Islam, and there's different like types and denominations of Islam, and they all tend to do it just a little bit differently, but they actually do, everyone of the Islamic faith prays 5 times a day as one of their pillars, right? Now, another huge one that actually is massively important is fasting during the month of Ramadan, right? Now, they do not eat from sunup to sundown during the holy month of Ramadan, which is meant to symbolize the time that Muhammad spent in the desert, right? Much like, of course, Lent symbolizes the time of Christ Ramadan is their version of this, right? And it relates to Muhammad rather than Christ, right? Now they fast from sun up to sundown, right? They only drink water during the day. And then at the end of Ramadan, they have a massive feast, right? And it's really, really cool. And I got a chance to experience this one time in my life with a friend of mine from college and his family. And it was a really, really enlightening experience, right? But fasting during the month of Ramadan is a very, very important pillar of their faith. And last but not least, the fifth pillar of their faith is the Hajj, right? And what the Hajj is a pilgrimage to the city of Mecca to visit the location of where Muhammad started the faith, at that massive temple, right? At that same temple that he went inside of and destroyed those statues, which from the outside perspective looks like this. As you can see, millions of people go every single year. And the closer view is this, right? And inside of that temple is just an empty room, right? Because that's where he destroyed all the fragments of the statue. Also, interesting fact as well, on the corner over here of the temple is a comet that apparently fell out in the desert and stuff like that, very close to when Muhammad began his preaching, right? But the Hajj, though, is a pilgrimage to Mecca, to that temple, right? And every single Muslim must do this in their lifetime. Now, really, really quickly, what that building is called is the Kaaba, right? And the Kaaba is that location and that temple where their faith began, right? And then it's very cool. They go around it a certain number of times. I think it's 7 times. They say a certain set of prayers, and that part of their faith is now complete, right? But a part of their journey is going there and visiting that location where their faith began, right? And so now what we're going to do is they'll go back into the Crusades and discuss how the fall of Jerusalem is going to lead to a very large set of wars that will change the tides of history forever. But I'm going to clip in a flip I did last year because it is phenomenal. Like, I did such a good job on it. Y'all go ahead and watch that. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Time talking about the Crusades when actually you really just need to know the general outline, right? So first of all, let's go ahead and start off with the fact that we got to talk about the cause, right? What was the cause of the Crusades that caused them to be launched in 1095, right? Well, there are two causes to the Crusades, right? When we're looking at the Crusades, you could make one argument to start off with, and it's the fact of the regaining of this city, right? So Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, fell under Muslim control right around, actually probably closer to about 900 AD, about 100 years before the Crusades ever even really started. Now, Jerusalem, though, something you need to understand about it, it is considered the Holy Land or a holy city amongst the very 3 large Abrahamic faiths, right? In this picture alone, you can actually see multiple different holy sites of Judaic, Islamic, and then also Christian faith, like symbols or like things like that. For example, the Wailing Wall is right here, the Dome of the Rock is right there. But when you're looking at the growth of this city, you're going to see Muhammad do some of his practices, and apparently he ascended to heaven in Jerusalem. You're going to see the Islamic faith have like some grounding in there. Well, of course, I just said Muhammad. So like also you're going to see the Jewish faith had grounding there. And also a lot of early work of Christ was actually done in Jerusalem as well, right? So the thing about it though is that it actually fell underneath the control of a Muslim like empire like very early on, right? The Umayyads and the Abbasids actually took over this entire area as they were growing once they actually all unified under the Islamic faith. Now the thing that actually happened though in the long run that's a real bigger cause, the second cause to the First Crusade, is actually mostly due to the fact that the Byzantine was becoming threatened, right? So when we look at the Byzantine Empire right here, and this is the Umayyad Caliphate, right? Jerusalem, as you can tell, was already under its control, but look how close they're getting to the Byzantine Empire and to Constantinople, right? The Muslim empires, the Muslim kingdoms at the time were getting dangerously close to the Byzantine Empire, leading the Byzantine to call for help, right? The Byzantine emperors began to call over on the Christian or the Western Christian armies to come over there and try to help them and save them from these people known as the Seljuk Turks that actually had like rose up during the like right around the turn of the century into about 1000 AD, right? 1000 AD. So what's going to end up happening though is the First Crusade would be called, right? And the First Crusade is going to be called at a very important meeting, okay? The meeting that calls the First Crusade is this thing known as the Council of Claremont, right? Council of Claremont. Claremont spelled C-L-A-R-E-M-O-N-T, okay? C-L-A-R-E-M-O-N-T, the Council of Claremont, right? The Council of Claremont is going to actually happen in 1095 AD, and it will actually occur within Rome. And it's going to be led by a very important person. It's going to be led by Urban II, okay? Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II in 1095 calls the Council of Claremont, and Matt has this massive speech where he talks about how, like, literally Christian knights need to go take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem hoping that there would just be some fighting on the side. So basically, in essence, he wants them to go on a pilgrimage, right? And he wants it to actually occur as like a plenary indulgence, and he plans on a crusade actually happening. At no point did he actually say, we're going to go take that stuff back from the Muslim empires. He actually was calling for a pilgrimage of Christian knights to go over to like actual Jerusalem, hoping that it would probably install a fight. Now, the thing about it that you also have to understand about like medieval society at the time is that most of these nobles, kings, and leaders were actually busy having wars with each other. So there's a very, very high likelihood that Pope Urban II wanted to find a way to unite them against a common enemy, right? To try and find ways to actually increase church revenue, and then also try and find ways to increase like European solidarity, right? Now, going into it though is also, some of you are now probably imagining a bunch of knights that are going to go off there, are ironclad, doped out in armor, ready to go, on the back of a horse, going off to fight these crusades, right? Well, the thing about it is, most of the people that actually went on the crusades were actually poor people, right? Most of them were actually poor people, and sometimes the first crusade is actually referred to as the People's Crusade, right? And actually, this is a really, really funny instance of one of those things. After Pope Urban II gave his really big speech calling the very first crusade, another person apparently actually did a very similar speech to that, but he actually traveled around areas of like poor, impoverished Germany, and his name was Peter the Hermit, right? Write down Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit apparently was this monk that was going around being like, oh yes, just like the Pope said, we must go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Grab your farm tools, your weapons, anything you have, poor people, and let's go, right? So ironically enough, there was like half a group of trained knights, and then the other half were just a bunch of poor people that were there to raid, take, and do whatever, right? So Peter the Hermit actually apparently led this People's Crusade, and also it was a pretty disastrous one as well. They like burned and destroyed cities along the way, destroyed entire villages of Jewish people because they were poor people from the Middle Ages, y'all. They didn't really know where they were. They'd get to every single city and be like, is this Jerusalem? And people would be like, no, that's really far away, right? And then they would like burn, destroy, rape, like take and loot everything that they could actually get their hands on, right? So the thing about it though is the first crusade was a pretty disastrous one, right? And it actually went all the way through Europe, starting all like, as you can see the first crusade, this red one right here, right? Two different groups of people. These are literally going to move all the way into Jerusalem, but also the first crusade is the only successful crusade, right? It is the only crusade where the Christian like warriors actually won, okay? Or you could argue that they won. They went and they established 4 strongholds, okay? Write that down. 4 strongholds were established at the end of the First Crusade, right? And those are going to be known as Edessa, like written right here. Edessa is going to be established. Antioch, okay? Tripoli, and then Jerusalem, okay? So those 4 states will be established. Now think about these states as basically like strongholds from future Muslim attack, right? They are basically like little areas administered over by Christian leaders and stuff like that, that have fortresses and walled cities within them that would actually prevent a future attack, and so they could actually control Jerusalem, right? But going into it, something you need to understand is that is going to be a pretty temporary thing because the Second Crusade would actually break out pretty soon after, okay? And the Second Crusade is going to last from about 1145 to 1149, and it is going to be a disastrous failure. And we're going to talk about it for literally about a minute and a half, okay? What ends up happening, though, is this area, Edessa, gets attacked by Muslim forces, right? The Muslim like kingdoms actually attack it, trying to get closer to Jerusalem and then retake this entire area, the area known as Edessa, and it falls under their control. A crusade is launched, a bunch of people go to try and fight it, and it fails miserably, right? It fails miserably, and that's all you need to know, really, right? The Second Crusade is a miserable failure because literally it was very disorganized, and nothing ever really went very well. But in this entire process, what's going on is like Constantinople and the Byzantine is just getting weaker and weaker and weaker because these crusading forces that keep sweeping through these areas are expecting to be rewarded, to be paid by the Byzantinians, to be given food and shelter and all this stuff. And when they don't get their way, they tend to kind of burn, destroy, and loot things, right? So the thing you need to understand, though, is that the Second Crusade is going to even leave the Byzantine a little bit weaker and a little bit weaker. And as you can tell, we're getting closer and closer to that year of 1453 when Constantinople falls to Muslim forces because they are just too weak to actually like to benefit themselves and or take care of themselves, right? So you got the First Crusade, you got the Second Crusade, but then you have the Third Crusade that pops up, right? The Third Crusade is mostly known by a war or a fight between 2 main individuals, right? So the Third Crusade is actually going to be launched, and it's going to actually... Ooh, wait, we got to look up the years of that real quick. That is a silly mistake on Mr. Terry's part. Sorry about that. Third Crusade. There we go. The Third Crusade is going to actually happen from about 1189 to 1192, okay? 1189 to 1192 AD. So about 30 years, or wait, no. about 50 years after the failure of the Second Crusade, right? Well, the thing that ends up happening though is it's mainly a fight between two key individuals, okay? Because actually it's not even so much a force of Muslims that are actually going to retake Jerusalem, because in the Third Crusade they actually do retake Jerusalem, right? They're actually being led though instead by the leader of Egypt, right? And his name is Saladin, right? Now he has a very long name, but actually in the Western sphere of things we just refer to him as Saladin, right? Or Saladin. So now Saladin was the emperor, was the king of Egypt, right? He was the Sultan of Egypt, and he actually had 14 kids and all this other crazy stuff. But the thing about it was that you need to understand about Saladin, he was a fantastic military leader, right? And also pretty much a certified genius. The guy was very, very well read on military strategy and things like that. And he knew that retaking Jerusalem was going to actually be a very, very big thing for the growth of trade industry, and then also for the growth of their Muslim of the Egyptian economy, right? So he actually goes over and takes over Jerusalem, where then several nobles are actually going to answer the call to go down there and try to retake Jerusalem back away from them and away from Saladin. And the main guy that shows up is a man by the name of Richard I, right? Richard I was the king of England at the time. He also has a nickname. He's known as Richard the Lionheart, right? Richard the Lionheart because he was such a great warrior, right? Well, Richard goes all the way down there, goes all the way down to Jerusalem, and fails miserably to retake Jerusalem from Saladin and his forces, right? Saladin takes over Jerusalem. They use the geography of the territory being a desert-like climate to actually lure Richard out further and further, and most of his men end up actually dehydrated and starving to death for long periods of time. But Richard the Lionheart actually fails miserably in this entire crusade, and he loses again as well. And Richard is going to be really, really important, though, because actually on his return back to England, when he's returning to England, defeated and actually dejected from losing the territory of Jerusalem to Saladin and his Egyptian forces, he actually gets kidnapped at one point, and he's held hostage by the Duke of Austria for somewhere in the and he's held ransom by his actually they call up England and they're like, hey, we have your king. You want it back? You're gonna have to pay us $125 million worth of silver, right? Which is absolutely insane. So the thing about it though is, and also funny enough, the people back in England didn't really even like him that much. Several of the English leaders were like, you can keep him. We don't really like him that much. He's never really here, and all he ever wants to do is fight wars, right? So the big thing about it that you need to understand, though, is that the Third Crusade is just yet another image of the inefficiencies of the Christian forces to be able to retake Jerusalem, right? And now something that you need to understand, though, as well, is how many Crusades do you think there were in the long run? Maria, how many Crusades do you think there were total?
Hundreds.
Not hundreds, no. There was 8.
What?
There was only 8. There was a lot of Crusaders, but there was only 8 in Crusades.
No, I think they had mini Crusades.
They were little baby ones. They were little baby ones and stuff like that.
They were trying to be mean.
They were trying to be mean to a lot of people. Very, very good. See, my wife knows about the Crusades. She's wicked smart. Everybody needs to know about these bad boys. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is later Crusades would also be large-scale failures. Some of the Crusades wouldn't even make it to Jerusalem because they got, stood up in Constantinople. One involves the Knights Templar and the Fourth Crusade, and then they literally, ransacked an entire city and then stole a bunch of stuff and brought it back to Venice. It's a whole thing. But the Crusades are a very, 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 very crazy period of time. But the thing that you need to understand is that there's 2 key effects that we're going to worry about in this study of Western civilizations. The 2 biggest effects of the Crusades are going to be, 1, you're actually going to see re-stimulation of trade economics and trade between Easterners and Westerners, right? Now, some of y'all are like, Mr. Terry, why would trade get increased during a war? Well, remember, y'all, it's that entire aspect of cultural diffusion, right? Whenever wars are perpetrated or whenever wars happen, 9 times out of 10, what does end up happening is a re-stimulation of economy and actually a movement of items through these different areas that are fixing to go to war with each other, right? So, large amounts of trade are actually going to increase in the High Middle Ages, helping lead to the prosperity of economics during the High Middle Ages, okay? Now, the other big thing, though, that is absolutely awful, that we still feel the effects of, which I was trying to talk about at the very, very beginning of this flip, is the fact that you're going to see a permanent fissuring split between basically the empires of the East and the empires of the West. Christians are going to begin to view Islamic people during this time period as villainous and a threat, right? And then Islamic people are going to be viewing Christian, like crusading knights and crusading armies and Christians in general as a threat as well to their livelihood and then also to their homes and their areas and their trade routes and their economies and basically their cultural institutions. And a big thing you're going to actually realize is that's going to lead later on to things like the exploration period, right? Because literally the Europeans can't pass through the Middle East anymore because the Muslims won't allow it, right? right? Because the Crusades actually create a very permanent fissure culturally and, like, I guess you could say economically between the two kingdoms, right? Now, also, the other big thing that you're going to see that's a very negative effect as well is you're going to see a lot of negative effects on the Jewish populations of Europe because it's heavily, they would be blamed for large, like, parts of these Crusades, and large entire villages of them would actually be, like, killed. Some, like, historians actually refer to the Crusade period of Europe as the medieval Holocaust, right? Because literally hundreds of thousands of Jewish people actually were, like, killed in the process of these Crusades as well. Now, going into it, though, also something you need to understand, the next thing that we're going to be talking about in class is going to be huge, right? But I want to go ahead and, like, talk about it real briefly so we can make sure we can cover everything, right? And right after that Third Crusade, Richard I, that dude that fought against Saladin, right, is actually going to die, right? Now, no loss, he wasn't a very nice king and stuff like that. He actually died from getting shot in the, like, shoulder with a crossbow and stuff like that by a child. Interesting little fact about this, a kid shot him with a crossbow, and literally they brought the kid in front of Richard. The kid thought he was going to die for sure, like, because, like, literally he was like, I just shot this guy. And he asked him, why did you shoot me with a crossbow? And apparently the little boy was like, oh, well, I shot you because you actually, like, led an army against my brother and killed my brother, right? And so a big thing about it, literally, instead of actually, like, killing the kid, instead of actually killing the kid and stuff like that, Richard forgives him and then gives him money and lets him go, right? Which is a very, very intense thing. But what ends up going down, though, Richard I dies from that crossbow to the shoulder after he had been held ransom for $125 million, and he was eventually let go, right? It's not really a loss, though, because he's not a very good king. He wasn't very, very good to the English people in the long run, but his brother was much worse, right? His brother actually ends up taking over the throne after the death of Richard I, and his name is King John, and he's a huge loser. Like, as you can see, he is a massive loser.
All right. Take care now. Bye-bye then. Loser.
Exactly, right? So looking at this as well, though, King John, though, is a loser for several different reasons. One, he lost most of his land in France to a very, very expensive set of wars. Another big one as well is he raised taxes on everybody. He got excommunicated by the church, and he was regularly imprisoning people for no apparent reason, right? And King John is an absolute scumbag. So the big thing about it, though, is we're going to talk about the things that happened after King John in class, okay? And we're going to talk about something really important. But I hope y'all enjoyed this flip. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.